Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University, to conduct the introductory session. Motin sir, now over to you.
Great, thank you. As you know, Bengali Academy of for Social Empowerment base is conducting a series of lectures on various aspects and themes. And I would like to say sorry because I'm a bit far from Calcutta and here my internet is also not that sound. I just had to come for an urgent work, but hopefully I'm audible, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, great. Uh, BASE is conducting a lecture series, and this is lecture number 17. And today we have got a very important speaker, and then also equally important topic. The topic, as you know, it's there in that poster, the crisis of citizenship and the Bangladeshi paradox. This is very important topic, and we have a very eminent speaker, eminent sociologist, Professor Tanweer Fazal. And this session will be chairing by our senior professor, Professor Said Abdul Hafiz Mainuddin. I'll just have a privilege to introduce both of them in our lecture series panel. Professor Tanweer Fazal. Professor Tanweer Fazal is a professor at the Department of Sociology, University of Hyderabad. Before joining University of Hyderabad, he was there at the Center for Study of Social System, JNU. Before that, he was also there at Jamia Millia Islamia. That means he has he has been serving three major central university of our country and prestigious central university. As a political sociologist, he specialized in the sociology of nationalism, community formations, and identifications with a specific focus on the implications on discourse of rights and entitlements. He is the author of Nation State and Minority Rights in India, a comparative perspective on Muslims and Sikh identities. Minority nationalism in South Asia, Muslim law and violence, reflection of practice of the state. Additionally, his research inquiry has a strong element of public policy orientations that involves rigorous analysis of existing policy instruments while suggesting new modes of interventions. In this regard, he has taken up a study of process of urbanizations in small and medium towns in India and the role of religion in making and the town planning in India. Recently, he has published a very fascinating edited book, a very fascinating book on the minority conundrum, living in a majoritarian times, published by the Penguin. Uh, I'm very much privileged that I was happened to be a student of him, maybe not with the same department, but was lucky that he used to occasionally visit to his chamber and we used to discuss on various things. Interestingly, he has played a very important role in the making of such a committee report. He was a senior consultant of in the Prime Minister High Level Committee called Sachar Committee. And today we are very much privileged that Professor Fazal has kindly agreed to deliver lecture in our base program. And this chair will be chaired by Professor Syed Abdul Hafiz Mainuddin. He is a senior professor of sociology and head of the department at the Department of Sociology, Vidyasagar University, Medinipur in West Bengal. Professor Moinuddin he did his PhD and masters, all his studies from University of Calcutta, and his field of specialization Muslim minority, gender studies, and sociology of religion. And he has published widely on the questions of Muslim women, sociology of religion, the OBC tribes, and most importantly, he has been important one of the important sociologists in our state, especially looking at the issues of Muslim women questions and the questions of divorce. With these few words, and today we have a great speakers and also a great chair. Both of them are sociologists in training. So without much delay, I will request our chair to further proceed this program, and then after that we'll be having question answer, and then vote of the thanks will be given by Professor Nargis Madam. She is a professor at Alia University in Calcutta. With these few words, with a lot of thanks to both the speakers and both the great sociologists. And now this is to Professor Hafiz Syed Moinuddin Saab to further proceed the program.
With the permission of chair, I want to say something. I would request all the participants to turn off their cameras যারা ক্যামেরা অন করে আছেন, যারা ভিডিও অন করে আছেন, কাইন্ডলি তাদের ভিডিও অফ করে দিন। I would like to request all the participants to turn off their camera. প্লিজ যারা ক্যামেরা অন করে আছেন, ভিডিও অন করে আছেন, তারা প্লিজ আপনারা ভিডিও অফ করে দিন, কারণ না হলে আপনাদের রিমুভ করে দেওয়া হবে। থ্যাংক ইউ ভেরি মাচ।
Good evening to everybody. I welcome you all. Really, this is a great privilege and honor for me for giving me this opportunity to hear this session. Actually, BASE is organizing lecture series. They have already organized a number of lecture series. Today, it is all about the crisis of citizenship and the Bangladeshi paradox. The lecture will be delivered by Professor Tanweer Fazal. Dr. Mutin has already mentioned about Dr. Fazal, Professor Fazal, young sociologist in India, who is working on so many issues, burning issues. In this platform, I want to say something about BASE activities. They are organizing this kind of lecture series, which is very important not only for sociologists, but for all the academicians in India. I have one request to the organizers. Please undertake projects and academic activities through which we can generate first-hand information, empirical data on Muslim community in general and marginalized community in particular. This is very important. We are talking about the underdevelopment of Muslims, the minority, the marginalized groups, but actually we don't have our database. So I would request the members of this platform to conduct empirical study, field-based study, through which we can generate data, and this information, these studies will help us to improve the conditions of the marginalized groups. I don't take much time. Now I would request Professor Tanweer Fazal to deliver his speech. Please, Professor Fazal.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mateen, for a very generous introduction. Well, Mateen would interact a lot with me during JNU when I was there in JNU, and then Mateen also happened to be a student. Since Mateen left JNU, I found no pleasure in remaining in JNU and left as well. So we begin with that. On that note, well, today this lecture or discussion has been titled The Crisis of Citizenship and the Bangladeshi Paradox. In the beginning itself, I would like to say that unlike the popular belief, as well as something which has entered into our policy paradigm and intellectual discourse, very often large-scale immigration or presence of foreigners in India, particularly in a region of Assam, has been taken for granted. Now, my problem begins with that because I do not see much evidentiary support to see migration usually is a normal human process. People do move from one region to another, but a concentrated population of a particular ethnic community into another region, to the extent that it inundates the parent community altogether, creates a sort of a crisis there, and fears of being completely outnumbered. This is usually unprecedented and generally happens when there is a very, very compelling reason. So this was one of the reasons why I started looking into this question. But more importantly, in a more focused way, I started looking at this question when the July 2018, the final draft of NRC, before I'm talking about the draft NRC, before the final one came out, excluded nearly 40 lakh people from claiming any sort of citizenship in India. This virtually meant that they would be rendered stateless, would have to go through detention camps or innumerable kinds of indignities, as well as torture, loss of livelihood, and all that which follows. So this was another reason why I started looking into it. And finally, we know a year later, when the final NRC was published, nearly 1.9 million, they say, nearly 20 lakh people ultimately lost their citizenship. The question, therefore, then was for me to look into NRC as a process itself, that is National Register of Citizens, and the way in which it was conducted. As a political sociologist, my interest has been into state practices. So apart from grand theorization of what states are, what is class location is, and whether a state is autonomous from the society or not, but we also need to see in how the state in its everyday bureaucratic practices figure. So, so that again became another kind of a object of inquiry. This brought me into another question, and which is a larger question about citizenship itself. That what constitutes citizen? What does it imply? We've seen that after the CAA, that is Citizenship Amendment Act, there was huge protests across India. A lot of people lost their lives. Why did people ultimately see it as a serious threat to their own existence in a society and polity? And this was probably because their entitlements, their existence, their identity today, to a large extent, is defined by the membership of a state. Without a membership, a legal membership into a state, you're virtually a completely disempowered, dehumanized being with no claims whatsoever. Thus, in this context, when we see that a huge number of people, nearly 2 million, when excluded from citizenship, those who had till date all the documentary supports which we otherwise in any other part of India have as proofs of our citizenship claims, despite possessing all that, because of a new exercise which is exceptional in that situation, now it is being argued by the Home Minister and others that it could probably be extended to the entire country, and therefore becomes even more serious than what ultimately it is. So we need to look at it with very carefully and see what how it works out and what its ultimate aim is. This is definitely a revisit of the citizenship theory which was adapted by India. Every state, depending on its own cultural, social makeup, comes about with its own definitions and ideas of what citizenship is. For example, in Germany or in France, one has to go through a process of Germanification or Frenchification to really earn the membership of those two states. Whereas in the United States, it could be until recently was far more easier, and this so different states have defined their own ways in which how citizenship is supposed to be granted. At the beginning itself, if you go into the Constituent Assembly debates, the debate over citizenship was extremely heated, and we saw that there were at least two completely extreme positions, one of which argued that the basis of Indian citizenship should ideally be, what is called, I don't know, it's a French word probably, but to pronounce it as just sanguine, which is that blood ties, right of blood, and not necessarily your own presence or your birth, but right of blood will be the basis of citizenship. This would mean that irrespective of fact, whether you are a resident of India or in any other part of the country or any other part of the world, simply because your blood and belonging, by ethnicity, by certain kind of cultural markers, by religion, for instance, you could claim Indian citizenship. You could as well be an Indian citizen. Something like today we have in Israel, which has this thing called right of return. So Jews anywhere in the world could go back to Israel and claim membership, irrespective of what ethnicity, nationality, or birth which they have had. But opposed to this view altogether was the view which was far more inclusive and which believed in a more universal idea of citizenship, which otherwise could be referred to as just solely, which is right of the soil, meaning whereby that those who have had birth in India, irrespective of what religion, what ethnicity, what culture would they belong, and only those who have had birth in India would be ideally the citizens of India. Ultimately, it is the latter view which prevailed, and this would be seen as the secular foundation of Indian citizenship. The Indian Citizenship Act, which came out in 1955, made basis of birth, and apart from it, it also allowed certain exceptions. The other was descent. For example, people who were of Indian citizens but settled abroad, say for instance in foreign service, but their wards could also become Indian citizens. The third way was naturalization. Foreigners who have lived in India for more than 12 years could apply for citizenship and become members, become a member of the Indian state or Indian polity. And the fourth one was through registration. This registration was for those immigrants who had come and stayed in India for more than 7 years. Continuous stay of in India for more than 7 years could become members or could become citizens, and there was a provision for that. So this was seen as far more open a system of according citizenship status to the Indians. However, if you recall that this was also a time when there was a large movement of populations. There were partition had recently happened. The process of migration from and immigration into from adjoining Pakistan and West and East Pakistan was continuing, and therefore there were also certain exceptions made, which was not necessarily through the provision of citizenship, but by various other systems, like permit system, declaration of evacuee property, which was later declared as enemy property or something like that. The ethnic or cultural markers did come into picture to a certain extent. For example, all those people who were coming from the other side of the border were readily granted citizenship. But while those, say for instance, Muslims who for briefly had shifted to Pakistan but now wanted to return, lost their property, as well as now were being stopped through a permit system, not being allowed to come back and gain Indian citizenship. So, however, largely the Indian citizenship acquired a republican form of citizenship wherein, just solely prevailed over any kind of a ethnic criterion to be introduced in granting of citizenship. Now, when we are discussing here today the question of Bangladeshi, a person who's also interested into looking at the cultural processes of labeling, etc., we can also see that Bangladeshi as such is a sort of a reference, is more of a metaphor which has meanings far beyond what it actually would mean. In actual sense, in a most limited sense, the Bangladeshi is a citizen of Bangladesh. But it acquires multiple meanings. For instance, from our Home Minister's statements, we know that they could be referred to as termites as well. They have been referred in literature as well as in public discussions as refugees, as settlers, as immigrants, foreigners, in various different ways. In the wake of the anti-foreigner movement in Assam, which began in the late 1970s and continued at least up till mid-1980s, the Bangladeshi would be more or less synonymous with the foreigner and would apply largely to Bengali-speaking refugees from Bangladesh, strictly in accordance with the Assam Accord of 1985. It would mean those who migrated from the former East Pakistan or Bangladesh, or today's Bangladesh, into Assam post March 24, 1971. This is the cutoff date. But when in social references as well as public discussion, it is not limited just to this category of people or migrants who arrived in Assam post March 24, 1971. As cultural markers, they would be, any Bengali speaker, particularly in areas residing in the charts of, say, Brahmaputra Valley. They could be many times these are also conflated with Bangla-speaking immigrants, majority of them who would have come to the areas of Assam at least 100 or 150 years earlier. The reference Mia, a reference to actually Muslims of Bengali origin in Assam, are also very many times used in along with the Bangladeshi, unless someone proves that he or she is a citizen. So by its implication, what I'm trying to suggest is that the Bangladeshi is not limited to a person who is, say, for example, an immigrant and having arrived in Assam post March 24, 1971 without the documents. The NRC exercise, which began following a Supreme Court order, now rested on creating a distinction between original and non-original citizens, residents of Assam. This artificial, kind of a classification was made based on titles, subtitles, etc., and would those who would be classified as original residents would actually bypass much of the tedious process of claiming or proving their citizenship, whereas all others had to go through a extremely torturous process of proving through a family tree, through a legacy tree, establishing their blood ties with a legacy ancestor who is supposed to have been existing in the NRC, which was held in 1951, or electoral rolls before the March 25, 1971. So many times it was extremely difficult to actually establish that. And in this presentation, I also, as I said earlier, that I'll like to look more closely into this kind of a mechanism of the state, the way in which the intellectual exercise, the state practices, the legal pronouncements came together, as well as the political process of the, say, the Assam movement, etc., came together in the production of this category called foreigner or a Bangladeshi. To look more closely into it, I am I'll go through or take you through 3 or 4 different sites. These are as I referred to earlier, the Assam movement itself, which emerged in the mid-1970s. The other was associated with the Assam movement was the emergence of collective violence or anti-immigrant violence, large-scale anti-immigrant violence, and how this was also an occasion for the configuration or reconfiguration of identities. And then I'll also look into a bit into the demographic data or the census exercise to suggest to see whether there is any evidence to establish that there is a large-scale inundation of Assamese population by Bengali immigrants post-1971 or Bangladeshi immigrants post-1971. The Assam movement began in the late 1970s. It actually began earlier with what it saw as itself as an anti-outsider movement, and as an anti-outsider sentiments, it tried to, mobilize what is called in Assam as anti-Bahiragoto slogan. The Bahiragoto being the outsider, and therefore the Bahiragoto did not have any specific ethnic, character. The Bahiragoto could be all those who were non-Assamese from outsiders, not necessarily simply the Bengalis, but also say the Marwaris, the Biharis, the Nepalis, or many others. Because one of the reasons probably for this not really capturing the imagination of the Assamese population was probably because it did not have very clearly identified other. The other was extremely dispersed, expansive. And it did not really focus on any particular community of people who could have been otherized. And so, therefore, as a result, the anti-Bahiragoto movement, though, did not attract much attention. The moment the Assam Students' Union, which led this Assam movement, refashioned itself as an anti-foreigner movement with very clear attributes of Bangladeshi, which is Bengali speaking largely, both Hindus and Muslims. But in many discussions, it could also be finally focusing on the Bengali Muslim. Now, interestingly, the Assam movement also, was able to draw the sympathy and the support of a large number of intellectuals of the region. These were the movement apologists who justified the emergence of such kind of a movement on the basis of certain kind of, logics, such as, say, for example, long years of colonial exploitation of Assam's resources by foreign and Indian capital, and therefore the emergence of such a movement against ethnic outsiders. Now, while this used some sort of a Marxist categories of analysis, but at the same time, such kind of argument also, went ahead to justify the targeted attacks and calls for expulsion of non-Assamese by saying that this was a general feature of all such movements. Nowadays, we say it as collateral damage. So they said that since the outsider was the most tangible symbol of colonial rule in Assam, and mind it, we are talking about the Bengali peasants largely. So these were supposed to be the most tangible symbol of colonial rule in Assam, and hence one can understand, despite the fact that one may despise, but at the same time one could understand that why they were targeted for violence. Now, in this kind of a broad polarity of the exploiter on the one hand, or the exploiter is the foreigner or the outsider, who is supposedly, exploiting the Assamese, the indigenous. So in this broad polarity of the exploiter and the exploited, the foreign capital, the Indian big bourgeoisie, the non-Assamese petty traders and shopkeepers, as well as the migrant peasantry, came to be presented, all of them came to be presented as the oppressor. On the other hand, the native bourgeoisie, the middle classes, as much as the Assamese peasantry and labor, were all assumed to be having no relationship of exploitation amongst them. So they were all one. And on the other hand, the oppressor, irrespective of what caste or class they would belong to, were all again similarly praised in oppressing the Assamese. This was the basis on which the Assam movement was justified, even by some of the left-leaning scholars of Assam. There have also been attempts to justify this Assam movement on the basis of not necessarily the class analysis, but also on the basis of ethnicity, and arguing that ethnicity, subnationalism are also important conceptual tools of analysis. They would say that that movement was not necessarily chauvinist, because it drew all classes of Assamese people. And so there were various kinds of justifications, and which continue to reverberate in the intellectual discourse of Assam. One of the triggers for the emergence of this anti-foreigner movement was a statement by a chief election commissioner of that time, Shakdar, who in 1978 in Ooty made a declaration that there were large number of inclusion of foreign nationals in the electoral rolls. Now, there was no basis or evidence to suggest that. In fact, the election commission actually doesn't have wherewithals to actually map the citizenship or the origins of any community of people. But at the same time, Shakdar went ahead to make this claim, but without necessarily mentioning the region or the state. But this was assumed by the movement leadership as well as the Assamese intellectual as another instance of how their complaints or their entire project of expelling the Bangladeshis or the Bengali speaking immigrants as was justified. The movement led to the picketing of government offices, statewide strikes, mass rallies, and various other styles of protest, and which demanded that there should be an urgent detection of Bangladeshis in the electoral rolls and the expulsion from the state. The targeting of the foreign nationals or the Bangladeshis marked a new shift in the politics of the organization. In fact, ASU in the beginning had, even before the anti-Bahirgota movement, was more interested in campaigns for the adoption of the Assamese language in educational institutions, or was in the mid 70s actually was associated with the politics aimed at material redistribution and structural transformation of the existing order. It was more carved or oriented towards a Marxist leftist kind of politics, which demanded progressive land reforms, nationalization of industry, security of poor peasants from eviction, procurement of and distribution of food grains, measures to control recurring floods, and other things. But this kind of a politics, which was which also looked into the sort of a you can say the distribution or the very skewed distribution of resources within the Assamese society, did not again attract the attention much, did not actually figure much in the imagination of the bourgeois press. But the moment the movement shifted towards ethno-symbolism, it became an ethnic upsurge, acquired chauvinistic characters. We found that it also started gaining huge attention in the Assamese press, which as it found some sort of a resonance with the Assamese ruling class. While the movement and its dynamics was one such context in which this production of the outsider, the foreigner, etc., was taking place, the other context in which this kind of a otherization, I can say, took place through collective violence. There were various, although largely the movement apologists or theorists would claim that the movement was extremely peaceful, but because of the impact of the movement itself, we can see that there are various occurrences of mass violence, most of them actually targeting the immigrant Bengalis and others. So at different junctures of history, the targets of violence were varied. In the beginning, there were also Marwari shopkeepers, then Bihari laborers, Adivasi plantation workers settled in Assam, Bengali Hindus as well. But by the time that the movement reached its peak, the most unreported but the most stark case of violence was the one which we all know are familiar with, is the Nelly massacre. The Nelly massacre, although in popular understanding was the killing of the Bangladeshis again, but in fact these were the people who would see themselves as what is called an Assamia category of people called non-Assamia Muslims. The non-Assamia Muslims are those Muslims who migrated to Assam and whose migration began at the turn of the century, around the late 19th and early 20th century. And these were the community of people who were essentially peasants, initially from the Mymensingh district of earlier Bengal. Their presence in Assam had a long history. Not only that, in fact, it was the non-Assamia's adoption of the Assamese language which actually resulted in the Assamese getting a majority in the Assamese-speaking areas in Assam. So, at one point of time, these non-Assamia Muslims were parcel of the Assamese mobilization, not Assamese mobilization, the idea of Assam itself. But now, with the emergence of the anti-foreigner movement, they could be easily clubbed with the Bangladeshis and were the targets of killing in the 1980s. So in the 1983, when the Delhi massacre occurred, there's virtual silence in the Assamese media. There is virtually, you'll be hard pressed to find any detailed report on it, except for those which emerge in the Illustrated Weekly or national press. In fact, I've hardly come across any serious work of scholars emerging from Assam on the Nellie massacre. In fact, the only scholar which I'm familiar with who has worked on this was a Japanese scholar, Kimura, from JNU, who for her MPhil worked on the Nellie massacre and eventually came out with her book. So there is a virtual silence around this huge violence in which 3,000 people, it is said, were killed in a matter of 3 to 4 hours. There are again justification for this massacre. The justification offered by the intellectuals emerging from Assam was that, well, this was the anger of the tribals, because at the forefront of the violence were Tiwa tribals who targeted the Bengali peasants. So it was the anger of the tribals against the land encroachment by the Bengali peasants. However, when Kimura interviewed the Tiwas who were supposed to have enacted violence, they had a completely different story to say. They said that it was under the influence of the Assam movement that they felt that these were the foreigners which needed to be expelled. And there was virtually no conflict over the land ownership as such. So the land alienation of the tribals is a recurring theme which has been repeated again and again by the Assamese intellectuals to justify such kind of a violence which took place against what poorest communities of the state. I would actually quote someone like Sanjay Hazarika, who listed 2 kinds of provocations for the Tiwa Fury or Tiwa tribals against the quote-unquote the Mias. The immediate being the alleged abduction of the Tiwa women by the Mias, which is alleged, and the long-standing one being the illegal encroachment of Tira land. In his words, the killings signified payback time for the victims. But as I said, the Kimura did not find any such justification. In fact, in Kimura's study, what she discovered was that the land alienation was an excuse which was being actually offered by the partisans of the Assam movement and not by the Tiwa tribals. There are also other ways of justifying violence by suggesting that it was actually everyone killing everyone else. It was not like only the Mias being under the attack. It was not like only the Bengali immigrants being targets of violence, but there were also some kinds of retaliatory violence too. So this kind of trying to establishing false kind of a equivalence between occurrences of violence also took place during this time. But what does violence do? This is what is important to understand. See, every enactment of mass violence serves several ends. For instance, new sort of identities are forged, new definitions of friends and foes, and new symmetries and asymmetries of powers are created after every occurrence of violence. The occurrence of violence itself is a statement of power, but at the same time, post-violence too, you will see new kinds of people and new definitions of friends and foes. In the case of the Nellie massacre, the non-Assamia Muslims inhabiting this region were reminded that irrespective of the fact that whether they adopt Assamese as the language, and irrespective of the fact that whether they send their children to Assamese, medium schools, but their Bengaliness was a permanent marker, irrespective of whether their efforts to assimilate. Similarly, the violence was also an occasion for Tiwas and other tribes to try to prove that they were as much Assamese as anyone else. So this was also a proclamation of their own indigeneity. And many times we see that these are the sort of contesting tensions which are sought to be resolved through the occurrence of mass violence. Interestingly, the reconfiguration of identities and loyalties, they claim to become being part of the indigenous, which they are, actually has also was one of the reasons for ensuring impunity to the perpetrators. So following the signing of the Assam Accord in 1985, we have the Assam Gana Parishad-led government established in Assam. One of the first things the Assam Gana Parishad government did was to withdraw all police cases filed against movement activists, including those against alleged perpetrators of Nelly violence. So the Nelly violence is one instance of mass violence with more than 3,000 people killed, but not a single person has been punished. Now, while so violence was one context in which we see the configuration and reconfiguration of identities and the definitions of foreigners and non-foreigners being taking place, very many times the demography has also been, relied upon to argue for how a huge migration has taken place and how the presence of a large number of foreigners in Assam is a reality. And this has also been repeated again and again in generations after generations, that how this threatens the Assamese culture, identity, and existence itself. But if we look at the process of migration in Assam, the first quarter of the 19th century, it is a very long drawn one. It is the fact that Assam as a region had been receiving various spells and waves of migration. In fact, one of the ruling communities of Assam, the Ahoms, themselves are migrants into the region. From the first quarter of 19th century onwards, we see that after its annexation by the British, Adivasi workers from Chota Nagpur region were brought to the labor-starved tea plantation of the state. This was followed with the arrival of Bengali Hindus, who actually filled up as administrative officials, clerks, teachers, journalists, and other things. In fact, at one point in the early years, the Assam's professional middle class was largely constituted of migrant Bengali Hindus, who also dominated the administration. In fact, Bengali became the official language of the area. The 1891 census, we see that nearly 1/4 of the population living in the Brahmaputra Valley, which is actually Assam is largely divided into Barak and the Brahmaputra Valley. And the Brahmaputra Valley is considered to be the abode of the Assamese speakers, or the quote unquote the indigenous. But as early as in 1891, 1/4 of the population living in Brahmaputra Valley was of Bengali origin. The Bengali presence in Assam also came about with the inclusion of Sylhet in 1874 as part of Assam. Sylhet was again a Bengali-speaking area, and with its inclusion, the Bengali population of Assam increased. This happened with the carving of out of a separate Assam province from the Bengali-speaking areas. And later, and we see that how the Barak Valley also came to be included in the newly formed state. The Barak Valley was predominantly Bengali. So people, those who are residing in that area, were Bengali speakers. They come to be included within this newly formed state of Assam, and thus the population of the Bengalis suddenly increased in the whole of state of Assam. But these are not immigrants because they were residing in their own areas. It so happened that their own area got to be included in the state of Assam. By the turn of the century, that is around early 20th century, The colonial policy was oriented towards encouraging peasantry from East Bengal into the from the adjoining Mymensingh district to settle in the wastelands of the Brahmaputra Valley. And we see that in fact, at that point of time, the land-owning Assamese welcomed the arrival of the migrants because these were farm workers. These were those who were ready to offer the labor, probably at a much lower labor price, and they compensated for the existing shortage of labor in the area. This was the same section of the population which later on adopted Assamese as their mother tongue and helped secure Assamese-speaking majority in the state. Apart from this, there are other instances of also migration when, say, for example, at the time of partition, when the East Bengal was partitioned and became part of Pakistan or East Pakistan, a new surge in migration occurred with the Hindu Bengalis who started vacating areas which have now become part of the newly found Pakistan and started moving into the different adjoining areas. Some of them would arrive in Assam as well. Many would go to Bengal or to Tripura. So partition-induced demographic readjustment was also prompted by the referendum in the Muslim Bengali-dominated Sylhet areas, which opted to be included within East Pakistan. So once Sylhet got to be included in East Pakistan, the Hindu population in Sylhet again moved out of the Sylhet into areas of northeastern states, and particularly so in Assam. Further, the territorial reconfiguration of Assam took place because of other reasons as well. Say, for example, Nagaland in 1963, Meghalaya in 1972, Arunachal Pradesh in 1972, Mizoram in 1972. These were carved out of the larger Assam state. And every such instance would also prompt an alteration in the demographic makeup of the state. So the history of migration into Assam is big. It is a long drawn one. And in fact, the tension between two dominant language speakers, the Assamese and the Bengalis, is an old one. And there have been various instances, even prior to 1971, there are various instances where of violence which occurred. So now the post the Assam Accord, and particularly after this whole emergence of the Assam movement, what has happened is that the foreigner is actually very often, despite the cutoff date of March 24, 1971, etc., the fact the foreigner actually gets to be conflated with the Bengali speakers, and most often it is the Bangladeshi gets to be conflated or overlapped with the Bengali Muslim, unless proven otherwise. So their expanding number is often cited as a proof of demographic invasion. This is seen as a threat to national security. I'll give you two examples. One is the 1998, the governor of Assam, who's supposed to have created the most mischief. This was a retired Army General S.K. Sinha from the state to which I belong, Bihar, who was clearly a right-wing leaning Army General. He submitted his report to the government of India. In the report, without necessarily citing sufficient evidence, Sinha separated the case of Hindu refugees from that of what he called Muslim infiltrators. So we have the vocabulary of the refugee and the infiltrator emerging in the official discourse. It existed within the right-wing discourse, particularly, represented by the RSS, but now it entered into the official narrative with Hindu refugees and the Muslim infiltrators. Sinha argued through his own undeclared sources of knowledge that immigration of the Hindu refugees had stopped after 1971. After the creation of Bangladesh, they stopped coming to Indian side. And on the other hand, the immigration of the Muslim infiltrators from Bangladesh into Assam increased manifold after 1971. As a result of which, he then went ahead to make projections that how this would lead to minority, the Assamese being reduced to a minority in their own land, that this would ultimately lead to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the region, and it was also a threat to national security because it would eventually, once Assam turns into Bengali Muslim or Muslim dominated, it would lead to demands for the inclusion of Assam into Bangladesh. So he presented it as a national security threat. This same argument came to be reverberated in the division bench of the Supreme Court of India, which finally emphasized, led by our Ranjan Gogoi, that that same Supreme Court order, which mandated a time-bound process of NRC update for Assam. And in this order too, the argument was that the immigrants were largely Muslims who could be susceptible to the ideological support from Islamic fundamentalists, envisioning, I'm quoting from the judgment, a large country comprising Bangladesh and the entire Northeast. Court actually discovered that there was a direct correlation between rise of fundamentalism and influx of foreigners, both assumptions, but nevertheless made as a part of the court judgment. Now, after having traveled this journey so far, the questions which remain to be addressed are that, see, ultimately, taxonomy is very important. The naming and labeling is extremely important. The categories and classifications are important both for knowledge as well as policy making, politics as well. So the questions remain that how do we decide who is a foreigner, who is an outsider, whether the two, foreigner and outsider, are one and same, or they're two different altogether. Our estimates of immigrants, which is largely the Bengali-speaking population in Assam, which has a long 150 years of immigration into Assam, history of immigration, is that being conflated or overlapped with that of the foreigners? In the intellectual argument in support of this anti-foreigner NRC exercise, even well-meaning intellectuals coming from Assam have come to argue that how Assam is going to be, Assamese itself are going to be reduced into a minority. But clearly here, they're conflating the long history of the presence of Bengali speakers with that of the foreigners. Further, there are more questions. If we go by the constitutional principle of citizenship by birth, in the beginning itself, I dwelt on that there are four bases on which citizenship across India is guaranteed. One is citizenship by birth. Anyone born between 1950 to 1987 is entitled to citizenship simply by birth. Thereafter, by birth to Indian citizens. So, citizenship by birth, citizenship by descent, citizenship by registration, citizenship by naturalization, these are the processes of acquiring citizenship. So, what happens to that? So, even if we assume that a section of the people who are classified as foreigners actually arrived post 1971 and arrived illegally, but what happens to the successive generation? On account of the principle of citizenship by birth, they all get to be included. On account of naturalization too, they get to be included as citizens. And all this came to be seized in Assam. So there is an Assam exceptionalism, which we today see in the entire this whole discussion on citizenship. And more importantly, when we talk about immigrants or foreigners, there is also its antithesis, the indigenous. The indigenous as a category is again assumed. Who is an indigenous? As I said, that there, if we look at the history of migration, virtually many sections of the Assamese population who today claim themselves to be indigenous were actually immigrants. So where and at what point do we put a cutoff date? And how do this whole idea of indigenous versus immigrants come to be decided? I gave the example of Barak Valley, which was actually predominantly Bengali speaking. This was the area of Bengalis, but it was included into Assam. Do they become then suddenly an immigrant, or do they come to be counted amongst the indigenous? In so far, the discussion on indigenous amongst the Assamese, there is no place for them. So there are many kinds of confusions and complexities which we and each of them have a deeply political significance as well. This is a little prolonged, but I have some important points which I wish to discuss. We arrive at a figure of 19 lakh in the final NRC. Before that, we had 40 lakh. Earlier, probably we had around a crore or something. So there are various levels at which the exercise took place. But in fact, the number also has been one of the bases on which political mobilization has taken place. Constantly an inflated figure of the number of immigrants, or the infiltrators actually, infiltrators or foreigners, has been circulating in the Assamese public discourse. And because of these inflated figures too, there is a sort of a, you can say, some sort of fear which it generates, generations after generation of the Assamese, that these are the people who are out to dislodge them from their own homeland. In the earlier, one of the supporters of the movement, Bisweswar Hazarika, put the figure at 77 lakh, which was nearly 50% of the state's then population. He was clearly conflating the immigrants with the foreigners. Then the ASU, in one of its publications, put the figure at 45 lakh. And which said, and in that publication, it said that out of these, at least 15 lakh had managed to enter into the electoral rolls. After the signing of the accord in which 1971 accepted as the cutoff year, the movement leadership put the figure of the foreigners so defined was at 20 lakhs. So there was no actually basis on which this count could have been made. Again, there are various scholars too who have attempted to, arrive at some figure about those who could be the foreigners and the number of foreigners in Assam. But again, in all these instances, there are problems because there's no clarity about the categories itself. Are we counting the foreigners who came post 1971? Are we counting the documented or undocumented immigrants? Are we counting all the Bengali speaking migrants into the Assamese speaking areas? So therefore, as a result of which, there's a multiplicity of figures, estimates, and these estimates many times are at cross purposes with each other. They use kind of methods which are not so reliable too. For instance, one of the estimate is based on the declining number of the Hindu population in Bangladesh, and which it then assumes that all this declining percentage of Hindu population in Bangladesh would have entered Assam itself. But we are not very sure about the destination, their destination itself. So they could have been headed towards West Bengal, Tripura, or to the west. So therefore, an exact figure about and also whether these arrived post 1971 or not, because the decline in the Hindu population is being counted from the 1947 onwards, when it was 27%, and then declined to 9% in 2001. So we are not very sure about these estimates and their exactness as well. Closer to our times, more recently, there are efforts actually, as I said, that ultimately the Bangladeshi comes to be this comes to be referred to the Bengali Muslim, and every time there is a rise in the Muslim population in Assam, this is cited as evidence by the Assamese public in the public Assamese public sphere, that this is evidence of the rise of infiltration into Assam. Even demographers, some of them established ones, have come to argue around these lines, and very often the rise in the population in the Muslim concentrated districts such as Nagaon, Kachar, Darang, Gwalpara, Kamrup, these are also cited as evidence for the emergence, for the rise of the foreigners. Now, this again would mean that every time there is a rise in the growth rate of the Muslim population, it has to be those coming from the Bangladesh side of the border. So there are various kinds of figures which are there available, and which they use methods which do not necessarily produce any kind of a exactness in figure, or the method themselves remain extremely suspicious. But what is most interesting is, although there is a chauvinist cry all around that the Bangladeshis are coming, and the quintessential Assamese intellectual will lend its support to this kind of a chauvinist cry. The official documents and skewed statistics, partial histories, conflation of categories, all are produced and reproduced in its favor. However, there is no discussion about the census figures. Census is actually the source on which we have so far relied, largely one of the most reliable sources in India on the basis on which we have relied to count populations. And from the census figures, what is evident is actually that post 1971 onwards, and this is something which I would expect all of you to remember and register, that post 1971 onwards, that period during which it is argued that there was a great explosion in the foreigner presence in Assam. In fact, Assam sees a declining growth rate of population. The decline is so much that it is actually less than the national average. So an area or region which is supposed to be inundated by waves of migration from the adjoining Bangladesh actually experiences a decline in population, a decline in growth rate of population. Well, I will request the organizers. I've sent the figures there, table. Can it be displayed? Hello? I know everyone is muted.
Dr. Mutin. Dr. Mutin? Is there anyone?
Well,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm here.
I had sent the. Yeah.
Nothing is displaying on the screen.
Sorry.
Can you make any arrangement for display?
Can you do that? It's possible through a screen share or something, but probably only someone who is hosting the program can do it.
Screen share. Screen share.
Matinda, this is Riaz. In the host, there you'll see the present now option. Present now. Usme present now mein you go and open the PPT or PDF jo bhi hai in a separate tab, and present now option mein you can select the tab.
Okay, let me check.
All right, I'll continue in the meantime. Okay.
Okay, sir.
So, as I said that. So since 1971, actually, there is a decline in the growth rate of population, the decennial growth rate of population of Assam. So you would see that prior to 1971, the population grew at 34% in Assam. But between 1971 to 81, Assam's population actually grew. There is a 12% almost decline. 11% decline. And Assam,
sorry, Tanweer sir, the screen is being shared now.
Okay, wonderful. So now you can see probably on the screen. People probably will have to put the camera on or something.
No, Riaz bhai, I'm not getting the option. Actually,
neither am I.
Hassan, you call me on phone. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, Tanweer bhai, you continue. We'll figure this out in 1 minute.
All right. Okay. So there is more than 11% decline in the population. Okay. Between 1971 to 81, as we move on to 1981 to 1991, there is again this more or less remains stable, this growth rate of population. But between 1991 to 2001, again there is a decline of further 6% from 24.24% between 1981 to 91 to 18.9 or around 19% in between 1991 to 2001. There is further decline in between 2001 to 11. So all these years, actually, we do not necessarily see that there is actually a rise in the population in Assam. If we compare with adjoining states of Northeast, during the same time, they actually see, sort of a, similar kind of a process. For example, Manipur, which had 32% population growth rate between 1917 to 81, declines between 1981 to 91 to 29%, 1991 to 2000 with 24%. But what I'm trying to suggest is that, in fact, the growth rate of population decline is highest in Assam, the area which is supposed to have actually been at the receiving end of migration. Remember, in most of the other parts of Northeast, there is some sort of a inner line permit question issue, and it is very difficult for anyone else who is not an indigenous to come and settle. But Assam, which is many parts of it which is supposed to be open, actually witnesses a decline during all this period, and this has not been addressed or by any of the those who are actually, fighting or pushing this whole argument about the Bangladeshi presence and incessant waves of migration into Assam. The other thing which is usually cited is that how there is the reference now is very often to the Muslim growth rate, and it is cited that the Muslim growth rate of population in Assam is high compared to the Hindus, and so this is again an evidence to that definitely, since it is far higher than the Hindus, so definitely there has to be an additional kind of a thing happening, and this additional thing is, of course, it is argued that it is the arrival of the Bangladeshis. Now, if we see the census of 2011, because after the census of 2011, when the Hindu and the Muslim growth, there was a sharp difference in the Hindu and the Muslim growth rate of population. This again began to be argued as an evidence to suggest that how there is a rise in the Bangladeshi population in Assam, and therefore the need for the NRC, etc. So in 2011 census, the rise in the Hindu population is 41.89% from the previous decade. Compared to that, the rise of the Muslim population is 77%. And this is definitely a very high, growth rate of population, which can actually, make anyone ponder as to why it is happening. And there has to be any additional reason. But when we introduce the backwardness thesis, the thing becomes far more clearer. In fact, areas or states in which Muslims are far more backward, we find a similar high backward in terms of literacy, in terms of educational opportunities, always as well as income levels, etc. We'll actually find a similar kind of a difference in the growth rate of population. For example, in Madhya Pradesh, the Hindu growth rate of population is 57.38, whereas the Muslim growth rate of population is 80.76. In Rajasthan, the rise in population of Hindus was 69.75% from 2001 to 2011, but the rise of the population of the Muslims was nearly 100%, 98.29%. Similarly, in West Bengal, 46%, 46.96, or you can say 47%, the Hindu population grew in 10 years. The Muslim population grew by 77%. So in most of these states are not receiving, actually, are not complaining about receiving huge waves of Bangladeshi. So this evidence as such is not a sufficient evidence to suggest that simply because there is a growth of Muslim population that we can say attribute it to the arrival of the Bangladeshis in Assam. In fact, if we say look at the growth rate of population of other communities, particularly which are considered as backward in terms of developmental indices, you can actually see that the figures are more or less similar. For example, the growth rate of population of the scheduled castes in Assam is 81.84%. The growth rate of the growth of population between 2001 to 2011 of the scheduled tribes in Assam is 78.9%. So in that context, one can see that the 77% growth in Muslim population may not necessarily be because of the arrival of the Bangladeshis. The third argument which the demographers make or is cited is about the certain Muslim dominated districts showing high rates of population growth rate, and this again is suggested as seen as alarming and seen as evidence of the rise of the number of Bangladeshis or the infiltration of Bangladeshis into Assam. Somehow, over the years, in the Assam movement, while we see that the Assam movement did not necessarily was religiously neutral when it came to seeing the outsider, as the outsider was the ethnic other, but not necessarily the religious other. So all it did not make a distinction between Hindu and the Bengali and the Hindu and the Muslim Bangladeshis, but more or less now, the Bangladeshis come to acquire this distinctive characteristic of being a Muslim and a Bengali speaker, and so therefore all discussions comes to settle around that. So therefore, in some of the Muslim-dominated districts, such as say Dhubri, Gwalpara, Barpeta, Bogaigaon, Darang, Morigaon, Nagaon, these are the districts in Assam which also showed a relatively higher growth rate of population. And this was again seen as an evidence of how the Bangladeshis are coming and settling in areas where there are big Muslim presence already. Now, the backwardness thesis actually can be holds good for explaining this population, quote unquote, population explosion in Muslim constituted districts as well. So whether you look at Lower Assam or in the Barak Valley, nearly 94% of the Assam's Muslims live in villages, and according to a Planning Commission report, they count amongst the poorest in the entire country. A decade or so back, Sachar Committee report gave comparative figures which revealed that the incidence of poverty among Muslims of the state was at least 19 to 20 points above state average, and 4 times more than the Hindu upper caste. So despite persisting poverty and illiteracy, state developmental activities remain the weakest in these districts with higher Muslim concentration. So as a result, we see that there is a high birth rate, but this high birth rate is also in those districts which are, in terms of developmental indices, the most backward. So lower the literacy, so the 3 indices then come to be seen in consonance with each other. So lower literacy, higher rate of population growth, and higher share of Muslim population. So these are the most backward districts educationally and as well as in other terms, and these are also which show a higher fertility rate, higher rate of growth of population between 0 to 6 years, and therefore, based on this idea, this argument of how backward communities continue to have larger growth rate of population, can be used to justify or explain this high return of population growth in certain districts of Assam. Now I'm coming to the final. So what I'm trying to say is that the kind of demography which is being and demographics which is being produced to construct this and establish this idea of a foreigner also is extremely questionable and remains extremely partisan. If we look at the practices of the state, we see that there are multiple legalities and various kinds of laws, acts, and other things since the partition years itself, since the 1947 partition years onwards. A host of legal instruments, especially in Assam, have been used to mark or expel those who are seen as supposedly non-resident as SMEs or supposedly seen as foreigners or immigrants. So you have uh, you know, I'm not going to the details, but since the 1950 onwards, we see that there are many legal instruments which have been used in Assam, and as a result of which, lakhs of populations, particularly the Muslim Bengalis, which have been expelled out of Assam. In the early years in 1950 itself, the state government adopted what is called the Immigrant Expulsion from Assam Act 1950. This empowered the state to declare any person or group to be inimical to the interests of the state and thus order its expulsion. Using this act, in the decades following independence, local police persecuted a huge number of Bengali Muslims, and it reportedly lakhs of them were expelled out of the Assamese area and into what is today's Bangladesh. Again, there was another prevention of infiltration of Pakistani National Act, which is called the PIP scheme in 1962. This too empowered the Assam government to expel nearly 6 lakh Bengali-speaking Muslims in a period of 8 years, that is 1962 to 69. Then we have the Illegal Migrants Determination Act, the IMDT Act, which aimed at identifying and expelling illegal migrants who had crossed international borders after March 25, 1971. So there have been a lot of legal instruments and which have been used by the Assamese bureaucracy, the state, and the police to constantly identify populations, mark them as foreigners, either expel them or to put them into detention camps. There are reference cases. There are also the Election Commission from the last 2 decades onwards has begun in earmarking as something completely, I don't see it as how it is constitutionally justified, but it began earmarking, a group of voters as D voters, or what is called the doubtful voters. The doubtful voters are actually seen as the doubtful citizens, because once they lose their right to vote, the doubtful voter are not supposed to have the right to vote. So once you lose your political right to vote, you actually are a disempowered citizen. And apart from that, it is also a stigma, which is which continues to exist and is not ever, one can get rid of. So an estimated 125,000 Bengali-speaking Muslims, Hindu Bengalis, as well as Koch Rajbangshis populate this category of D voters in the state. This D voter as a category does not exist anywhere else. So what I'm trying to argue is that in this context, when there were so many kinds of legal instruments, the continuous watch, on the part of the police, the enactment of foreign tribunals, and now you also have the NRC. All this is still, if we see that, and also the evidence which I cited from the census figures, it is virtually impossible to see a continuous flow of the foreigner into Assam. But however, this continues to, have some sort of resonance in the Assamese intelligentsia, the political circles, both the right as the left wing, the intellectual discourse, and in which the most problematic thing, as I said, is this conflation of categories of immigrant, the Bengali, the Mia, the Bahirgoto, the foreigner, all counted and at will, sometimes counted together, sometimes separated, depending on what kind of a political or argumentative end it is going to bring. So the need is for a definitional precision, clarity of categories. All may not mean the same, but they are conveniently used together to justify something. which is which seems to be completely constructed, produced, and I would say largely an artificial category, the foreigner. What I in my understanding, I would argue that while as began in the beginning itself, as I said, that well, migration is something which is a human process. Populations are moved from one place to another, but this kind of a large scale population movement from Bangladesh into Assam is difficult, and particularly post 1971 is extremely difficult to establish. However, there is a political agenda. There is also a cultural, kind of a politics behind it, which justifies, which constantly reproduces these kinds of arguments, and results ultimately in the expulsion of nearly 20 lakh people. Remember, all these people who have been expelled probably carry the same kind of documents which you and I have to prove our citizenship, which would mean, say, the passport, the name in the electoral list, the all other kinds, ration card, and many things. But none of them hold good in Assam. Despite them having taken birth in Assam, the citizenship by birth, which is a provision available to everyone in India, is not available to those in Assam. With this, I stop. I know it went on for quite a long time. It was a very, yeah, I had to cover various, the trajectory was long. And I'm thankful for you, most of you, for all those who have been patient. And I'm sorry that it took us such a long time.
Thank you, Professor Tanweer Fazal, for your thought-provoking, illuminating lecture. You have talked in detail the problem of Assam, Assamese, migration, and the Bangladeshi people who have, for this or that reason, they have been migrated to Assam. Thank you very much. Now we can take questions. The floor is open. Dr. Motin?
Yes, I think there are questions in the chat box. You can scroll that, or else maybe you can take a couple of questions.
You please help me.
Okay, our team will help you. All right.
What's the question?
Abid, please go ahead.
Okay. Hello.
Hello.
Jim Dreamer has asked a question. Scheduled caste population growth in Bengal, it is unbelievably high. Is it because of Bangladeshi migration or more people identifying as scheduled caste?
The second part of what was it? That more people identifying?
More people identifying as scheduled caste.
As scheduled castes. In terms of the scheduled caste population, you're saying? Hmm?
Yeah.
Okay.
West Bengal.
West Bengal, okay. No, I cited figures of Assam when it came to the scheduled caste thing. But however, this is something which is there in other states too. And see, the scheduled caste category has existed for a long period of time now. It from the Government of India Act 1935 onwards, that this category and the castes, the whole list of castes which are to be included in the scheduled caste are there. So more people identifying themselves now as scheduled caste should not be the reason. If a category is new, one can say that okay, gradually people have come to be get awareness about their own status as to whether they belong to SC or not. But this is a long historical category, and so that ideally should not be the reason. That doesn't seem to be logically, coherent. But if we see the figures from other states too, as I said, that there seems to be a correspondence between backwardness and higher population growth. As literacy as well as developmental indices improve within the communities, their growth rate of also comes to decline. This is something which geographers and demographers would also probably agree with me on this.
Okay, next question is from Murshid Alam. Murshid Alam has asked a question that the Assamese movement position centers around Bengalis as settler colonialists. How would you respond to this justifying ideology?
See, colonialist is this completely inverts the idea of what colonialism is. Colonialism is all about, if we go with the historical experience of colonialism, is about expansion of market, of the complete takeover of the resources, and ultimately in service of if we go by Lenin's idea of colonialism, imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, ultimately in the service of capitalism. But who are the people who have come and settled in Assam over more than 150 years of the process of migration? Majority of them are peasants. Many of them moved because during the colonial period, when they were taken as farm laborers to tea plantations, as well as the large farmlands in Brahmaputra Valley. So to call them as colonialists would not justify any theory of colonialism for that matter. One can invent arguments and categories, that's another thing. But if we go by historical experience of colonialism, this is not what colonialism is all about.
Okay, next question is from Muhammad Irfan. He has asked a question. Due to recent policies of this government related to citizenship, Muslims felt alienation in their own land, and it leads to communal disharmony, alienation, and social tension. Why is it so?
Well, I didn't get it entirely. Is it a reference to the NRC and the CAA process?
Yeah. It is an. I think it is an all India question. So.
See, when you say why is it so, you go back to the old RSS argument about who are the true and nationals and who are supposed to be the second-class citizens in India. And there's a clear distinction in the RSS ideology between the religions of Indian origin and religions which are not of Indian origin. They assume that, therefore, these are people who are supposed to be non-nationals if their holy land is not in India. So this Pitri Bhumi, Punya Bhumi argument which Savarkar made, and which has also in some form or the other been repeated by Golwalkar, not Godse, Golwalkar. So we will see that this is something which is part and parcel of the idea of the Hindu nationalism, and probably through CA and NRC, an attempt is being made to realize that. CA is a very clear indication of that only those who are Hindus largely, although they have included Christians, but that is for argument's sake. We all are aware that how many Christians are there in anyways in the neighboring countries who would be interested in coming to India. But it of course is except for the Muslims, all others could be could apply for Indian citizenship and be granted. So see a scenario, for instance, in Assam, where nearly 20 lakh population has been excluded from citizenship. This would include a majority of them would be Bengali Muslims, but also a good section of them could be Bengali Hindus. Once the CA is in place, all these Bengali Hindus could easily be granted the citizenship, whereas another class of population excluded for the same reason, that they could not prove their that their ancestors had come before 1971 and that their names were there in the legacy documents. Exactly for the same reason. In Assam, I'm talking. So I'm saying the implication of the CA, that while one class of people who have been excluded for the same reason gets to be included, another class of people are excluded because a simple application of this CA Act. So it makes a distinction between categories of citizens based on their ethnic or religious origins, and therefore it is definitely a significant distance being traveled from what the idea of citizenship which we had in India at its beginning, which I constantly keep referring to as just solely or the right of the soil. Now we are moving towards just sanguine, and which is the right of the blood. So ethnic criterion being included in the definition of citizenship. Yeah.
Any other question? So I have one question.
Yes, sir.
To Professor Fazal. The Assam movement, or the question of migration, Bangladeshi, all these issues are related with religion. We are usually understanding it by Muslims, those who are categorized by them as infiltrators. But today in India, Bangladeshis, I mean the Bengali speaking people, means both Hindus and Muslims. So in CAA they are giving some liberty to Hindus, but how far these are reliable, it is a question. So what will happen in their future, nobody knows. Both the Hindus and the Muslims, they are in a crisis on the question of citizenship in Assam. Yes?
Yeah, I agree with you. That in fact, see, such a large number of people, if they are excluded from citizenship, what do you do with them? Because simply because you've proved that they do not, they could not prove themselves to be Indian citizens by the standards of the NRC, doesn't mean that they are citizens of Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is not accepting them. You have a whole bunch of nearly 2 million people, a large number, and now bereft of any right. Now, what do you do with them? It is a crisis situation, and which needs to be addressed. And besides, it will tear apart the society, which gradually was trying to overcome all its cultural fault lines of the past. It is ultimately leading to further, divisions and increase in the situation of crisis which we see there. And now the threat is that it is to be extended to the entire country. So that is why we need to be extremely cautious about what is happening and very vigilant on that. Yeah.
Exactly. But the question is that in Assam, or the Assamese, those who are intend to exclude the Bangladeshi population, they are also not the homogeneous group. They have their own differences. But still, they are forgetting all these differences and they are against the Bangladeshis, means both the Muslims and Hindus. This thing, I think, amazing. And as a political sociologist, we have to observe what will happen in near future.
No, you're talking about divisions amongst Muslims in Assam,
No,
or
among the Assamese.
among the Assamese? Yeah, see, Assam is ethnically very diverse. So, this is a broad definition of Assamese, but within that also there are tribes. There are also those who came, as I said, many years back, and became Assamese speakers, started sending their children to the Assamese medium schools. They are referred to as No Assamiyas. So it's a completely extremely diverse society. And the question, of course, is that with constantly those invoking the past, or inventing a certain reading of the past, ultimately this is going to create, as I fear, deep divisions, or even if the divisions are there, maybe enhance them. And this there needs to be a civil society effort, including political mobilization, which could avert it, realizing that this is not going to take the society into lasting peace. Ultimately, what we need to look for is, for prosperity, growth, etc. too, we need peace and we need harmony. So coexistence is ultimately has to be accepted by everyone, and that has to be the principle for the communities to come together. So what is happening right now is extremely dangerous, has potentials which may actually tear apart the society. That is something which I fear.
Thank you, Professor Tanweer Fazal, for your thought-provoking lecture on crisis of citizenship, Bangladeshi paradox. Now I request to extend vote of thanks. Dr. Mutin.
Yeah, if Professor allows, there are few more pertinent questions. I don't know, it's up to the speaker and with the chair. I mean, like,
Okay.
well,
Okay, Mateen.
there is, yeah, yes, sir.
Mateen, just give me a 10-second break. I'll get a water for myself, and then
Sure. Abid is here.
Yeah.
So why don't, I mean, like, please, could you please just read out the questions of Aftab Bhai, and then before him, questions by Debasmita. I mean, club few questions, and then I think Aftab Bhai question is quite important, and then Onju Murang, also that question is also a bit important, and then we will wind up another 10 minutes, I guess. Abid, go ahead.
Okay. First question is by Onju Morang. How do you differentiate between indigenous people of Assam and ethnic Assamese? Hello?
I got it, huh? Indigenous Assamese and ethnic Assamese, huh?
Yeah.
See, I think in the while in my presentation also, I had raised my doubts about this category called indigenous. Because as I said, that those who claim to be indigenous, they also, some of them, have arrived in Assam maybe earlier than others, but still their origins are not necessarily only from Assam. So the question therefore is that while we can play upon these categories of indigenous, etc., but there is nothing constitutional. You see, if we go by how the state and politics and political order and ideas of citizenship, etc., are organized, it is as of now, till date, there is nothing which is called indigenous in Indian society. The tribes of India claim to be indigenous, but that too has not been guaranteed to them. So this is an invented category of indigenous Assamese. Basically, to make a distinction between those who are supposed to be non-Assamese. This is completely, sort of an idea which someone may claim at any time, and and use it to expel others out. So it is a category of inclusion and exclusion, and which, although some scholars refer to it, but they never come to define it. I did not come across it. And there was a lot of debate about who is an indigenous and who is not. Similarly, when you say ethnic Assamese, the ethnic Assamese, again, there are Assamese speaking population, they call themselves the Exomia, Ahomia, and all that. There are, in terms of ethnic terms, there could be a section of population which is, which has a longer historical antecedents to claim itself to be Assamese and quote unquote original Assamese. But whether the indigenous Assamese and the ethnic Assamese is one and same, or indigenous Assamese is a larger, a more umbrella kind of a category which also includes the ethnic Assamese. There are a lot of debates around that. But as I said, at least with the indigenous question, I would say that it is an invention which does not receive much support. Say, for example, do we exclude the tribes from Chotanagpur region who've been there since the 1850 onwards in the tea plantations from being indigenous? If they are not indigenous, what are they then? So these are the things which are extremely sensitive and have deep political connotations. So it depends on which ideological side of the divide do you belong to, that you sort of give weightage to such definitions.
Okay. Next question is from Devasmita Dev. She has asked your opinion about how the media and the current regime has reduced the anti-NRC movement as only anti-CAA movement.
Anti what movement? Again, and I got the anti-CA movement.
How the media and current regime has reduced the anti-NRC movement as only an anti-CAA movement.
Okay. Well, yeah. I think in the rest of the country, it is both anti-NRC as well as anti-CAA. But in Assam, largely the movement, when it emerged, it was against CAA, because they felt that still, despite a good number of people being excluded through the NRC process, the through the CAA they will manage to get included. So I don't see the anti-NRC and anti-CAA movement being reduced to simply anti-CAA in the rest of the country. In the rest of the country, the resistance is against both the NRC as well as the CAA, but both are being taken together, and only when they're both taken together that we can understand the implications of it. And that is the reason why we see that a large number of Muslims in various parts of the country, the Shaheen Bagh and the Jamia and the various other different in the UP and in Bengal, in various places, that they rose against it, because they saw that NRC was, and this was particularly after, that the Home Minister told us that you have to remember the chronology. The NRC has come first, and then the CA. The NRC will also be implemented across the country. So the resistance was against both.
Okay, last question from Aftab Elat. You have already answered the second question of his. The only question remains is, he wants to know about the impact of CA NRC on stigmatized Assamese Muslims of Bengali origin. How has CA and NRC stigmatized Assamese Muslims of Bengali origin, especially those who are not in NRC, as well as other people who are not in NRC?
No, actually, can I frame that question
Yeah.
a little more clearly? Yeah. Yeah, my question is that your lecture was largely, you covered a lot of historical material, but that was mainly about a situation just before CAA and the nationwide.
Yes. I think I've lost you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Actually, some call came in between. Okay, it was largely you are covering a historical situation that was just before the nationwide NRC.
You're right.
Yeah. So, what are the new implications? That was, for example, the CAA, because it is not going to be directly affecting that 5.5 lakhs Muslim that is already not in the NRC. And also, it might further stigmatize the rest of the people who are even now included in the NRC, probably, but this threat will be looming large in the future. Also, the next aim will be the Bengali Muslims elsewhere in India. They might be targeted because even in Kerala, I'm from Kerala. There were attacks against the Bengali migrant workers. Immediately after these things development came. So how will Muslims politically, the legal options are very much limited, because we are not expecting the Supreme Court or the Constitution Court will reverse this law or this process itself, the NRC process itself. What are the political options left for Muslims to continue? Because as we have seen, just before the corona virus, the religious rights and the other violent attacks against the possibility of even a non-violent struggle against this.
Yeah. See, the question is now, of course, it directly affects the Muslim, but it actually hurts the very foundation of the Indian imagination. And therefore, it should actually be of a matter of concern for all those who have some faith in the idea of democracy and secularism. Now, if that is because what is clearly visible is the course of politics which is leaning heavily on the side of the Hindu right. The NRC and the CA, as I said earlier, is part of that same idea about the earlier Hindu nationalist theory about the Holy Land, and you all are familiar about it. The fatherland and the Holy Land both have to be same for a loyal Indian true Indian national, and that would apply to only Hindus or those religions which were of the Indic origin. So this that clearly, tries to completely invert the whole idea of India, particularly the constitutional imagination of India. And this should alarm everyone. The course left is today, right now, is only the mobilization of social power, which is social mobilization. You're right. It has to be a non-violent, peaceful mobilization, irrespective of the extent to which the might of the state is unleashed on them, because this needs to be the movement needs to be as inclusive as possible. It cannot just simply be restricted to a section of the population. The threat is much larger, and even if it immediately affects only Muslims, but it might not rest there again. So therefore, it is a serious threat to the idea of democracy itself, and we need to be very, very alert, and not only alert, but also proactively think about what to do about it. As of now, you're right that NRC itself was something in which the Supreme Court assumed executive powers, and therefore the Supreme Court too was deeply involved in ensuring a time-bound completion of NRC. So at least on that thing, it was difficult to challenge and receive any favorable judgment in the Supreme Court. So the other course left is what always matters in a democracy, and that is the mobilization of people. What I say is social power vis-a-vis the political might of the state.
Thank you, Dr. Tanweer Fazal.
I think, yeah, Dr. Nargis Madam will propose vote of thanks now.
Okay.
You want to say something as a chair, sir? I mean, you can.
No. Please ask Dr. Nargis to extend vote of thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mateen sir. Thank you, Moinuddin sir. First of all, I would like to thank BASE for giving me the opportunity to deliver vote of thanks. Good evening to all of you present here. On behalf of Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to our today's speaker, Professor Tanweer Fazal from University of Hyderabad, for his excellent deliberation and very much informative speech for the audience. Thank you, sir. I would like to thank Professor Syed Abdul Hafiz Moinuddin from Sociology Department, Vidyasagar University, for coordinating today's session. Thank you, sir. I cordially thank all participants throughout the country who joined today's lecture and constantly show their interest to BASE lecture series, and also to those participants who have raised very thoughtful questions after the session. Thank you all. I would like to thank BASE President, Vice President GS, and all members for their active and sincere support to make BASE lecture series happening successfully. Once again, thank you all for joining today's program. Thank you. And there is an announcement for our tomorrow's lecture series. Tomorrow we are having BASE English Net Set Preparation, lecture number 3. Topic is British Literature, Issues and Challenges. It will be delivered by Muhammad Tariqul Islam, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Coach Bihar College. It will be at 7:30 p.m. sharp. So thank you all once again. Thank you.
Well, I would say that, can I speak, Mateen?
Yes, sir, please.
I would say that I'm very thankful that, and also extremely happy that this kind of a, exchange of ideas is taking place, and you have been able to bring up a group of extremely interested people who have a range of questions, and sitting all through this lecture was not an easy task. One question which I see now in the chat box, which probably it is from the Basmita Deb, which I didn't respond probably, and which is, the question is about, is right to citizenship by birth in Assam denied to only Bengali Muslims? The answer is no. It is denied to those who are considered as foreigners. But largely in terms of implication, it will impact the Bengali Muslims, the Bengali Muslims declared as foreigners. That's because we now have CAA, and through CAA the others may get included, and you know, this category of people will be the CA doesn't work for them. So that's why. So I hope that clears that out. And yeah, thanks for organizing this, and thanks for being patient. Thanks, Professor Hafiz, for chairing the session.
Thank you very much.
Hello, sir.
Yes. Hello.
Yes, I am Dr. Subhash Rai Chaudhary from Kolkata. My one point is this. I would like to share with you that in Assam, I have heard it that Assamese, original Assamese, they don't want to Hindu and Muslims outside Assam should stay in Assam, because they are very much a nation that is Assamese, and Assam government was issued one notification that the person should know Assamese. Those who are engaged will be engaged in school, college, universities, etc. So how do you like to focus on this issue that Hindu and Muslim both are in Assam? Assamese, they don't want to stay there. How do you feel it?
Is it addressed to me? Is the question addressed to me?
Yes.
No, what I assume that you began by saying that.
Is your object, Dr. Subhash? Is your observation or question? Dr. Subhash?
It seems more like an observation.
I think. Yeah, more like observation, and I will request Dr. Subhash to mail the questions to us, and we will send it to Professor Tanweer Fazal for your further, academic engagement over email. That would be better, I guess.
Exactly.
All right, it's quite late also. Yeah.
Then, Dr. Mateen, we can conclude, end the session.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, all of you.
Okay. Thank you also.
All right.
Thank you all.